The slave community presentation. How did slaveholders utilize paternalism and Christianity to defend the owning of human chattel? Well, this all started by many protesters, saying that it wasn't right for slaves to be faithful and have the right to Christianity and stuff like this. So slaveholders, they claimed to be Christian in order to justify the slavery. They found multiple claims in the Bible that they should be pro-slavery and it was the right thing to do. In the Old Testament, in the Bible you can find that it said pro-slavery was very common, such as like in the Israelites, slavery was a thing, and there was nothing against people that were slaveholders. In the New Testament, it kind of ignored the fact of slavery, but it did say that Jesus did condemn it. Uh, many of the slaves tried to claim to be Christian, but many of the protesters who believe they shouldn't be allowed pretty much said that in order to be faithful to this Christianity, you had to read the Bible. And what the slaveholders would do is that they wouldn't give the slaves the power to read the Bible. It was pretty messed up, but that's just how things went back then. What strategies did slaves employ to resist, revolt, and sustain their own independent communities and cultures? The major ways that slaves resisted were through rebellions and revolts and their little-known tactics and ways of violence. Adding to that, their rebellions, revolts, and stuff like that, they found ways to actually escape or run away from the plantations, which also made the owners of these have to always keep an eye out, and it just led to all kinds of things that helped the slaves out. They also tried to do small things and forms of rebelling. They would break owners' tools. That way, it would decrease the overall workforce or workload that they had to do. It was just little things like that. I found that they said the women were found more to do these little things because the men, they said that they would disguise an illness or anything like that to in order for them to decrease their workload. They would just disguise an illness and stuff like that. How did slaves use white Southerners' own philosophies, paternalism, and Christianity, for example, to their advantage of these efforts? Well, the Southern whites generally believed upon the thought of paternalism, which paternalism it's the belief that the slave owners pretty much believed in what they gave the best advantage of the slaves, pretty much, and stuff like that. They took in consideration what would be the best disciplinary thing or anything like that for the slaves. Which this actually messed up the truth of what subjugation was in any way of human action. This was an atrocity. In these cases, this made slaves after this they pretty much developed and lived in their new ways and developed a new culture. The consequence of them creating a new way to live, this caused this made their lives terrible. This resulted in the uprising of all kinds of deaths of blacks. It was terrible. They got hung and stuff like that. That's when all this started, and it was pretty bad for them. In the South, there was hardly any resistance, and so this oppression would just spread all the way to these little local slave areas, and that's when all the mass killings and stuff like that would happen. Are there examples of revolt and rebellion by slaves, and how did slaveholders react to those revolts? Well, there's multiple examples, but pretty much rebellion and revolts, they're pretty much just slaves, just teaming up and just revolting on their slave owners and just trying to find ways to defeat and get out of how they're being mistreated. Rebellions, of course, they were a continuous big fear to slaveholders in the South, as slaves actually took up 1/3 of the population. It was projected to be around 250 slave rebellions before slave was actually finally abolished. In the South, I did find that the whites actually outnumbered them by a lot. So, rebellions still did happen, but they were they were scared because whites, obviously were overpowered back then. So they didn't really happen frequently, but they still happened. The first revolt happened in 1663, and that was in Virginia. And that actually consisted of other whites, and that one is what I read. But in 1687, it was the first all-black revolt. To prevent things like this from happening, the slave owners would they would do actually various of things. They separated their loved ones. That way, if they ever revolted, they wouldn't know the fate of their kids or loved ones. They kept them uneducated, maybe not giving them ways to learn how to do stuff like this. And they also beat them, of course, which is just terrible.